Father, thank you for bringing us to this time and this place. We ask that you meet us wherever you find us this morning, wherever that is, as we walk in these doors, as we come to hear from you. And we pray that by the time we leave, that people will know and we will be able to say that we have surely been with Jesus. And we pray these things in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Please be seated. Well, I'm going to do something this morning. Rather than preach from the gospel, I'm going to preach from the Psalms. We have the Psalms in our lectionary every Sunday, but we don't often preach from them. And I think it's interesting to know that behind the psalm that you heard this morning, the 27th Psalm, is a real person and real stories and real events. So in our psalm this morning, here's what you heard in the first verse. Psalm 72, verse 1 says these words: "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is my stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" Now, who do you think that was written about? Who was that? Who are these psalms about? Whose life? It's David's life. And he's talking about strongholds and fear and salvation and somebody delivering him and why he should not be afraid of anybody. So I want to talk to you this morning a little bit about what it is to have spiritual courage in our lives. Okay? Spiritual courage. But to do that, I know of no other place than a story that I learned as a young child that I'm going to open up for us this morning in ways that I hadn't seen before. It's the story, what do you think would be the iconic story of facing your fears and having courage in the life of David? David and Goliath. You're right, so sharp this morning. Right there, right with me. David and Goliath. But to do that, I want to look at what they call, literary people call, a literary form of a backstory. A backstory is the story that precedes the story, that sets the stage for the characters, the location, the time, the setting of the story that's told. For instance, George Lucas, before he filmed the original Star Wars movie, had already written 2 prequels to the Star Wars movie. So that when we saw the original Star Wars, there were adults in that movie. But then later he came out with, interestingly, two prequels which told the story of growing up, the characters growing up. But they had already been written. The backstory is the story that precedes the story. So I want to talk about the backstory this morning of David and Goliath, the historical setting, the location, the places where we find this story taking place. Now, the first thing we notice is that it takes place in the valley of Elah, which is a very well-known valley in Palestine. It's known or called the Valley of Elah because of the Elah trees. There are giant oak trees that surround this valley. If you've ever visited there, which I've had the opportunity to do, you can see in this valley, it's very barren, it's very sparse, except for these 2 ridges and these giant oak trees, these giant Elah trees that grow there. In this nearly mile-wide valley, it's enormous, it's huge, and it's barren and it's vast. It's located right in the heart of Palestine between a series of gorges and ridges and valleys. Now here's the important point. It is the main connection between the Mediterranean Sea on the west and the Judean mountains on the east. It's that critical corridor of high strategic importance. In fact, it's the only trade route to get from the Mediterranean plains, from the Mediterranean Sea, to the capital city of Jerusalem. It's the only clear path from the coast to the mountainous region. So you go through it from the coast, you go up into the valley of Elah, and just beyond that lies Hebron, and then there is Bethlehem, and then there is Jerusalem, the capital city, 18 miles north of the valley of Elah. About a 5 hours march for a hardened army. So you can see the strategic importance that it is the channel that leads to the capital of Jerusalem. You hold the valley of Elah, and you control Palestine. You hold the valley of Elah, and you can cut off Jerusalem. You'll own it if you can capture the valley of Elah. That's why this valley has been the scene of epic battles in the history of the world. For instance, in 167 BC, Alexander the Great, when he conquered the world and conquered Palestine, gave Palestine to the Seleucidian Empire. That was Seleucid. He was a Greek Hellenist. They brought the Hellenistic culture into the Hebrew world. Well, there were a couple brothers by the name of the Maccabees. They were like the Hatfields and the McCoys in those days, the Maccabees. And they started what was known as the Maccabean Wars against the Greeks, the Seleucid Empire. They defeated them. They recaptured and reclaimed Jerusalem. They restored the temple. They cleansed it of all of the pagan idols that the Greeks had bought in. And so to this day, the Jewish nation celebrates that great victory with what day? Thank you, Doug. You were all, Doug already heard this message at 8 o'clock. Now, do you see he's claiming to be smart? Like I'm the only one here that knows the answer? Oh. It's the Feast of Hanukkah, the Festival of Lights, representing that the light was brought back into the temple in the capital city of Jerusalem. 1,000 years later, after Jesus was born, when we find the Crusades, Richard I took his army to capture Jerusalem, and guess which valley he had to go through to get there, to capture it from the Arabs? The Valley of Elah. He ran into a Muslim Arab leader by the name of Seleucid that absolutely cleaned their clocks and sent Richard and his army back to England with their tail between their legs. This valley is of high strategic, critical importance. So it's no wonder then that in the year 1000 BC, 1,000 years before Jesus, we find two major armies lining up to do battle here. We find the Philistines. They are a seafaring people from Crete who came and settled the coastal region of the Mediterranean in Palestine. They're tough, they're rugged, they're battle-tested, they're dangerous. And on this day, they hold the South Ridge. The Israelites, their background, they were slaves for most of their time. Then they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. They were shepherds. They were goat herders. They weren't really trained for fighting, but they had picked a man by the name of Saul to be their first king. They wanted to be like all the other nations. They started gathering armies together, palaces, thrones. God said, I'm your king. But they said, no, we want a real king. God said, I am a real king. No, we want a king like all the other nations with a crown and a throne and an army. So God gave them Saul, the first king of Israel. So there they are in the valley of Elah. The Philistines hold the southern ridge. The Hebrews hold the northern ridge. A mile-wide long valley in between them, which is a veritable no-man's land, the Valley of Elah. And here the story continues in 1 Samuel, verse 17, verse 8. Now, don't forget the psalm that we read. And it says this, Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, why do you come out and line up for battle? I am a Philistine, a warrior, tough, dangerous. And are you not the servants of your puny little king Saul? Choose a man. Man up. Let's meet in this valley and have him come down to me. And if he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects and your servants. But if I overcome him and I kill him, you will become our subjects, and you will serve us. Now, a little more of the backstory here. You know, we have somebody a long time ago, actually in the 1800s, developed the theories of the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age. Let's just locate where we are here for a second. The Stone Age started around 9300 BC. That's where you chipped flint and you made arrows and you could make cutting instruments and all that kind of stuff. That lasted for a long time until the Copper Age, when they developed copper and learned they could melt it down, and it was a malleable substance, and they could have spoons and forks and knives and things like that. But then somebody, for some reason, made a mistake one day and mixed some of that with tin, and they ended up with a thing called Doug? Bronze. Very good. I didn't mean to wake you up. It was bronze. Now, bronze was hard. It was a great fighting instrument. It's around 2500 BC. Around 1000, around this time, we start moving into the Iron Age. But because Israel and Palestine are so far removed from Rome and from Greece, it really hasn't hit there yet. So the Philistines are still using bronze. Iron was a great thing because they ran out of copper. So they had to find something else, and there was a lot of iron around. And you could sharpen it. It made a very dangerous weapon. But right here, you're going to see in this narrative, we're still just at the end of the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age is dawning. And so here they are. The terms of the engagement are remarkably simple between these two armies on these two ridges. When the two armies reached a stalemate, they decided to settle the conflict in single hand-to-hand combat. Our best against your best. Our champion against your champion. Winner, take all. Everything is on the line. This is the ultimate press on the 18th tee. This is it. We get your homes, your cars, your families, your schools, your educational system, your hospitals. We get the whole kingdom. Mano a mano, one on one. Your man and our man. Now, the Philistines, in a strategic move, send their man first. He's a well-known warrior. He is legendary. He is massive. He is monstrous. He is menacing. He is the current heavyweight champion of the known world. He is a giant by the name of Goliath from the city of Gath. Of enormous physical stature, the Bible tells us that he is 9'6" tall and still growing. He wore a helmet of bronze that you could use as a house planter. It was so big. His coat of metal weighed nearly 200 pounds. I want you to remember these details because they're very important in the backstory of what's about to take place. In his hands, the Bible tells us he has 3 separate weapons, all designed, interestingly, for close hand-to-hand combat. He has a javelin, which you can throw at short range with great power from a mighty arm, but only at short range. He has a spear used up close to penetrate bronze armor. The shaft of the spear is the size of a telephone pole. And he has a sword of bronze to finish the job up close and personal. And he has a shield bearer. In those days, in the armies, it was called the buckler. I don't know why, but it was called the buckler. He's carrying a shield that's about the size of half of your garage door. It's made of a heavy wooden frame covered in leather and bronze. Once it's put in place, you can't even move it. It's so heavy. That was the idea, though, you know. Everything about Goliath was for hand-to-hand, up-close, one-on-one combat. Shield in front of him so you couldn't get to him, javelin and a spear, and then he finishes the job, comes around the other side of the shield, and he finishes the job up personal. His armor, his weapons, his training were all designed for one thing and one thing only: hand-to-hand combat. So he stood and shouted, "Choose a man. Is there a man among you? Is there a man among you? Come down to me, and we will fight, and we will kill." The air in that valley, when I visited there, they told us, was so thin and clear that you could hear the human voice nearly a mile away. So, here we find the record of a military crisis taking place. Two great armies. The battle lines are drawn. The terms of the engagement have been set. Between them is a valley that is a veritable no man's land with a giant warrior standing smack dab in the middle of the valley. The text goes on in verse 11, on hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. You better believe they were. For 40 days the Philistine came forward every morning, and every evening he took his stand. 40 days and 40 nights he thundered this challenge like clockwork, not once a day, but 2 times a day for nearly 6 weeks. Every morning, here comes Goliath. Every evening, here comes Goliath. And the text tells us that every soldier was dismayed and terrified. Every soldier contemplated his own fear and his own cowardice in the face of the giant, in the middle of the valley. But I think there was one soldier that was more afraid than all the rest. One that was more afraid than all of the others. Who do you think that was? It's Saul. Saul was 6'6". He was a giant compared to the other Hebrews. He stood a head above them, the Bible tells us. But compared to Goliath, he was nothing. But know this, he was their leader. He was their champion. He was their king. Saul knew that his men, every single one of them, expected him to go out and accept the challenge and fight the giant. But he couldn't move. He was terrified. Fear controlled him. Every day and every night, he'd lay in his bed, disgraced, embarrassed. Fear had such a control over him that he couldn't move. I mean, that is the nature of fear, isn't it? Fear makes cowards of us all. Have you ever had a giant stand in your path? In your valley? You know what that valley's like? Do you know how big it can get? How dark it can get? How barren? When it lasts day after day after day after day and calls out your name, and you're immobilized, and you can't move. You know, some fear in our lives is imaginary, and it needs to go. I remember the story I read of a woman, a psychologist, that was on an airplane, and she hated to fly, but more than anything else, she hated to fly in storms. And the pilot came on the intercom, and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, fasten your seatbelts, brace yourselves. In about 20 minutes, we're about to hit a storm. It's going to be a very bumpy ride." And the moment he said that, she said, I grabbed my white knuckles, grabbed the seat. I started sweating. I went into a panic attack, waiting every second, every minute for that storm to hit. I looked at my watch, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. It seemed like an eternity. 20 minutes came. 25 minutes. It was a half an hour. 40 minutes later, soaked with sweat, the pilot came on the intercom and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, we were able to fly over the storm. You can all relax." And she said, "You mean I spent 45 minutes in a panic attack for nothing?" I used to tell my kids, don't open your umbrella until it rains. You know? But some fear is real. You know, I love Martin Luther, and Luther suffered all of his life from what he called in the German the Angststörungen. These were existential panic attacks. He lived with them without any modern-day medicines to take off the edge. Luther said, for him, not only was that darkness of the soul and of the night, that panic and that terror, Luther said to him, not only did it happen to him in his life, but for him to know God the way he got to know him, Luther said that fear was necessary for me to know the fullness of God. Some fear is real in our lives. And here we find these men in the valley with a real giant. This is real history. This isn't a fantasy story. This has really happened. But here the story takes a surprising turn. There's a shepherd boy watching his father's flocks. He's 14, 15 years old. And his father comes to him and said, I would like you to take a meal up to the army to your brothers, your older brothers, and give it to them so they'll have something to eat. And so the shepherd boy leaves his flock and he goes up to his brothers and he's giving them their food because it was hard for armies to get food in those days. So families often fed them because they're living in the same territory, in the same area. And all of a sudden David sees this giant come out and he hears this choose a man and he looks around. He's, okay, who's going to go? And nobody moves. Well, how long has this been going on? This has been going on for weeks, David. Weeks. This has been going on for 6 weeks. Twice a day? David said, well, I'll go fight him. I'll go down to that valley. He's not going to mock my God. He's not going to let us be controlled by fear. We might be afraid, but it's not going to control us. It's not going to tell us what to do. It's not going to make decisions for us. And they say, David, you're just a boy. Well, David starts walking through the camp telling everybody, I'll go. I'll go. I'll go. Word gets back to Saul. There's a shepherd boy that's mocking you, that's willing to do what you can't do. What are you going to do about that, Saul? Saul said, get him in front of me. And he calls David up before him. And I know what Saul's got in mind. I got to shut this kid up. He's embarrassing me. So Saul says to him, look you're just a boy. You're a shepherd. Don't you know that? You're just a shepherd. You have never been in battle before. You have never seen men die. You have never seen hot blood flow. You have never thrust your sword into a man's chest. You're a shepherd. You've never been in the valley of fear. You've never had to fight. You're just a boy. Just a boy. And David said, So shut up, will you, David? Just shut your mouth and go back to your sheep, where you belong. And David said to Saul, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. And when a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it. And I struck it and rescued the sheep from its mouth. And when it turned on me, I seized it by its hair and I struck it and killed it. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. I think Saul was saying, okay, big boy, we'll see how tough you are. You go fight that giant. I can't shut you up, but that giant will. You don't have a prayer. And this is where I want to talk about spiritual courage. There's a couple little things happen here. The thing that David says is he's reminding Saul that I have a spiritual history. A spiritual history. And so do you, and so do I. A deep reality of faith in David's life to which he could confidently appeal in times of trouble. Over and over and over and over and over again, he had seen God at work in his life. His convictions rested on a time-tested reality. His faith was confident because it had a history. His faith was not dependent upon the size of the giant or the width of that valley, but on the spiritual activity of God in his life. What made David unique in all of Israel was his spiritual response to a challenge. Here's the way I have it figured out. When the time came for his faith to be tested, it had already been tested. He was sure that God could be trusted. The Lord delivered me from the lion and the bears. I was out there all by myself with only God. He's proven to me that he's trustworthy and true. I know it. I've experienced it. It's a part of my life. And I would just ask you, what is your story? What is your spiritual story, your spiritual history? I have a journal, and in that journal, I write down every time when God has been faithful to his promises to me. Every one of them, since I was a little child. So that I can go back and when I get in that valley and I see that giant, I can go back and say, it was here. God delivered me. Here, God delivered me. Sometimes it takes 5 years, 10 years, but God delivers me. He does. David had a spiritual history. Well, there's something else that takes place here. Then Saul dressed David in his own tunic, put a coat of armor on him, and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on the sword over the tunic and tried walking around because he was not used to them. But he said, I cannot go in these, he said to Saul, because I'm not used to them. So he took them off. I love this. He had a spiritual history, but he had a spiritual identity. God not only delivered me, God made me. And when he made me David. One thing about David, he knew who he was. Backstory. You know I love these backstory things. I'm sorry, don't flick them upon you, but I do. In those days, at the end of the Bronze Age, ancient armies had three kinds of warriors, trained warriors. They had the cavalry, were on horseback or chariot, the advanced forces. They had the infantry, heavy armor, hand-to-hand combat, swords and shields. And they had something called the slingers. Better than bows and arrows were the slingers. Leather pouches, long ropes, and stones. So I happened to get online last week to look up these slingers. They were often the key, I found, the historians tell us, to the ancient battles. They were so popular that in 2500 BC, there were giant storepiles of slinger stones that have been found in Egypt, Assyria, and Rome. In 1300 BC, there was a cache of 40,000 stones for slinging found in Dorset, England. 40,000 that came from the 1300s, just 200 years, 300 years preceding this battle. In 400 BC, Homer said that the Greek infantry suffered severely from the Persians because of their slingers. They could never reach the enemy to fight them in hand-to-hand combat. The slingers wiped them out. So, interesting. So I decided to find out if the word slingers was in the Bible. Guess what? It's all over it. Look it up. A couple passages. 1 Corinthians 12:2. They had their bowmen who could shoot arrows and their slingers to sling stones. With either their right hand or their left hand, they were so good. They were the Benjamites, Saul's kinsmen. David's family, by the way. I mean, you can imagine if that's all you learn to do all your life is sling a stone, you get pretty good at it. When my father was still alive, about 10 years ago, I took him and my mother up to New York City to Radio City Music Hall to see the Rockettes because when he came home from the war, he met my mother in New York and they went to see the Rockettes. So we, got him in there. He's 90 years old now, great seats. And he watched them kicking their legs and everything. And he thought they were still the same girls. I kept saying, no, Dad, they're different. They're different. Honestly, they're different. Afterwards, I said to my younger son, I said, that's pretty impressive how they could all kick together. He said, kick their legs together. He said, Dad, that's all they do. They don't do anything else. They don't go to school. They don't work. They just kick their legs together every day, all day. That's all they do. They ought to be pretty good at it. And so should a slinger. That's all they did. 2 Corinthians 26:14. And Uzziah prepared for all the army shields, spears, helmets, coats of mail, the hand-to-hand combat, and stones for slinging. 2 Kings 3:25. And they overthrew the cities, and on every good piece of land, every man threw his stones until it was covered, till only its stones were left, and the slingers surrounded and conquered the city. Judges 20:16. Among all these were 700 picked men who were left-handed. Every one could sling a stone at a hare and not miss. I don't know what this thing is about left hand. You'd have probably been a slinger, Chuck. So Saul thinks, okay, I'll send him out there. I want him killed. Goliath can kill him. That's the only way I can shut him up. I'll put him in my armor. That's the hand-to-hand combat thing, the terms of the engagement. But David says, I can't use this stuff. I can hardly move. This is not me. I can't go with these. I'm not a soldier. I'm a shepherd. I'm not trained for battle. I'm trained for raising and protecting sheep with my sling. I'm a slinger. David saw himself as God saw him. I'm a shepherd. God made me a shepherd. I can't change that. That is who I am. I cannot wear someone else's suit. I started thinking about that because God did make every single one of us in this room. He made us. There's nobody here that has the same fingerprint, the same eyes, the same body, the same mind. You're unique in all of history. Handcrafted, handmade, formed by God before the creation of the world for something, a calling. Luther put it this way, that we all have a vocational calling and a spiritual calling. He said, God made the world so that he would make everybody have a vocation that they would be gifted at. It might be an electrician or a carpenter or a computer operator or whatever it might be. And if everybody fulfills their vocation, the world will work great. God has a job for you. It was made just for you and your gifts and talents. But he said, then we have a spiritual calling. And if everybody finds that and fulfills that in the church will be great. And they're all important. It's not just ministers or preachers or lay readers. Everybody's important. I found that out, when I had my toe surgery. I had that toe surgery. I didn't think toes were important until I heard it. It immobilized me. I couldn't walk. Hey, if you're a toe, you better be a good toe, or the body can't move. They're all important. So my question for you would be, not only what is your spiritual story, but what is your spiritual calling? Who are you? Who are you? And when we get mixed up is when we start doing things we're not supposed to do, that we think we can do. I learned that when my kids were young and I wanted to coach one of their teams, and I was all prepared to coach basketball or soccer or baseball, and they decided to play hockey. At 5 years old, they're called mites. And I Couldn't even skate, but I volunteer. I'll be the coach. I know how to play basketball. That's 5-on-5. Hockey can't be any different. I forgot that when you play hockey, you have to put these steel things on your feet, and then you have to get on ice, and you fall a lot. And you know why you fall a lot? Because ice is slippery. Our team was 0-19 midway through the season. Not only that, but we hadn't scored a goal. I had parents throwing beer bottles at me. I knew we were in trouble when there was a rush across the blue line one time towards our goalie, little Brandon Weedweiler, and the nose at that size, it's just looks like a helmet with skates on the bottom of it. And he was skating around in circles inside the goalpost. I was Brandon. He was looking for clover or something in there. I don't know. I learned a hard lesson in the secular world. Don't do things you don't know how to do. David says, I'm a slinger. I'm a shepherd. That's where I fit. Well, let me finish this up. Courage has a sense of spiritual abandonment about it, too. It has a history. It has an identity. And it has a sense of spiritual abandonment. He took his staff in his hand, his shepherd's staff, 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with the sling in his hand, he approached the Philistine. As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, I love this, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the giant. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it, struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. The favorite method of release for a slinger was to whip that swing around in ever-widening circles faster and faster and faster, and then like a softball, throw it underhand. The Israeli army did a study of the ballistics of the stones, and they found out that it was traveling at the speed of a modern-day .45 caliber bullet, and that slingers in those days could hit birds in full flight in the air. Guess what? This giant never had a chance. He was dead on arrival. David ran quickly. I love that. I love that about David. I love his heart. He ran quickly. I heard a speaker a couple weeks ago, and he said that the people over 55 years old were asked, and 60 years old, what would you do differently in your life? And of course, there are a number of predictable things, but the interesting one to me was that they said, I would have taken more risks with my life. Faced more fears, gone with more abandonment, no regrets. I'd have gotten out there. I'd have gotten in the battle. See, there's always risk involved in advancing our lives and advancing the kingdom. There's always risks involved. Always. There's risks involved in our church. Moving forward, there's always risks involved. David runs quickly to the giant through this valley of fear. Goliath is in heavy infantry and he can't move. He has 200 pounds of armor on, designed for close-range combat. But guess what? He's immobilized in this armor. He can't move. His shield bearer, his buckler can't move. They never had a chance. Slingers beat infantry every single time, and David was a slinger. But you must be willing to run towards that battle, towards that fear, towards that giant. Faith does something. It's active. If you say to me, well, Stu's a man of faith, I would say, how would you know that? Would you cut me open? Could you find faith in there? Would you take an MRI or a sonogram? Where would you find the faith in me? How would you know that I would be a man of faith? There's only one way, by what I would do. Faith is an action. It's not a feeling. You can talk to me all you want about your spiritual feelings, but I watch what people do. You can't see faith unless it's put into action. Noah preached a sermon on faith for 125 years with a hammer and a saw without a drop of rain. He did something that God had told him to do. The Bible does not consider a truth to be known until it has become a truth that has been experienced, trusted and tested in our lives. So David ran quickly to the battle in complete abandonment, trusting his spiritual history and his spiritual identity. But he was still afraid. He had to face a giant. You know how I know he was afraid? Why do you think we know he's afraid? How many stones did he take? How many? 5. Why do you think he took 5 stones? He's going to figure, what if I miss? What am I going to do then? I'm surprised he didn't take more. But I can tell you this, in his mind, he wasn't sure he was going to kill that giant with that first stone. He had 5 of them. He was scared to death running toward him. But he was willing to take the risk. I may have told you this story, I don't know, but I sort of want to close with it and then have a pastoral word. Years ago, I was speaking at a church in Denver, and after church, I had to catch a flight back to Pittsburgh. And the fellow taking me to the airport told me that I asked him what he did, and he said he was the coach of the United States Olympic diving team. I thought, wow, this is great. So I asked him the question, the obvious question. When the Olympic gold medal is on the line, it's the 10th dive, and your diver's standing with his back towards the water on the 10-meter platform, with just his toes on that platform. What do you tell him to do? And he said, well, I only tell him to do 2 things. Take a deep breath and jump. Take a deep breath and then jump. Get off that board. Because he said, I figure out, guess what? They already know what to do. They've rehearsed that 10,000 times. They know what to do. That's not the problem. The problem is sooner or later, you have to jump. You got to get off the board. You got to get in the game. You got to take the risk. You got to put it all on the line. It's the only place where you truly encounter God. It's the question, are you willing to do whatever God would ask you to do in your life? Are you? Am I? And do I then have the courage to do it? Whatever God asks. Okay, I'm done. It's the pastoral word. I was sharing this story with my counselor. I have a counselor. It's called a life coach these days. It sounds more professional. But I have one all my life. He's a great guy. He lives in Detroit. And we were meeting, and I was sharing with him this story, and he said, So, Stu, who do you think you are in the story? I said, well, I'm David. Obviously, I'm David. Silence. So who do you think you are in that story? I said, I think I'm David. Oh, no. I am? He said, yep. You're Goliath. You're Goliath. You're so stuck in your armor that you can't move. You're immobilized. You paralyze yourself all the time. At my age, I'm Goliath? Yep. It's like operating systems in a computer, he went on to say. There's Apple and there's Microsoft, And it's really hard to change your operating system. But you got to do it. It's hardwired, but you got to change it. You got to start learning how to take off pieces of armor one at a time and putting them down so you can get freed up and so you can move around and be the person God wants you to be. Get out of that armor. David didn't put it on, and neither should you. You need to take it off. So here we have the story of a man who has a spiritual history, that knew his story, that God had protected him, a spiritual identity. He knew who he was, how God had made him. And he had a spiritual abandonment and willing to do whatever God asked him to do because God had called him. And so he writes in the psalm, "The Lord is my light and salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" Whom shall I be afraid? For in the day of trouble, he will keep me safe in his dwelling. He will hide me in the shelter of his sacred tent, and he will set me high upon a rock. Let's close in prayer. Father, thank you for these words from David. And may you internalize them for each of us. Enough said. Amen.